I'm Bob Bordone, and welcome to another edition of Negotiation in the News. So, it's the morning after President Trump hosted Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for a lavish dinner at the White House. It's also the morning after the House of Representatives and the Senate voted almost unanimously to release the Epstein files. So, what does all of this have to do with negotiation? Well, it all relates to the challenge of what does it mean to be ethical in negotiation. Today, we're going to use these two news events to offer you some tips on how to stay ethical in negotiation, and we're going to share some science on what happens when sometimes even people who want to be ethical end up being less than ethical. Let's go. Okay, so there are these two big events, and actually much more in the past bit of time that has gotten me thinking about the challenge of ethics in negotiation. You know, when President Trump invites the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to a lavish dinner, now it might not be troubling to give a big dinner for a foreign leader or the soon-to-be leader of Saudi Arabia, except for the fact that this was the guy that, according to intelligence services in the US during the first Trump administration, was responsible for calling for and then actually giving the order for US citizen Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist with the Washington Post, to be assassinated. So, why would the president suddenly now not only invite this person into the White House, but throw a lavish dinner for him? Let's take the second example. Just a few weeks ago, virtually every single Republican in the House of Representatives were saying that they would not vote to release the Epstein files. And in fact, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, resisted having a vote being taken, such that there actually had to be a House override. 4 Republicans had to join with all the Democrats to force a vote. Then fast forward to yesterday, and every single Republican, except for one, suddenly sees fit to vote yes. So let's analyze from a negotiation perspective. How do we think about this? So if you're finding yourself in a negotiation of any sort, maybe it's about whether the air conditioning in your house works and you're selling the house and it kind of works on Mondays and Wednesdays, but mostly doesn't work. Or maybe it's about what your salary at your last job was. And you know that if you tell the truth, you're probably going to get an offer that's less than if you spruce it up by $5, $10, or $15,000. There are all sorts of ethical questions that we are always facing in negotiation. And I want to give you kind of 3 guideposts that might help you. Guidepost number 1 is really understanding what is the relevant law, what is required in a particular situation. So I know most of you are not lawyers, and don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with the law. But there are some basics. And the most basic thing you need to know in negotiation is really about the law of fraud. And what that really means is that you cannot actively say an untruth that you know to be false, that it's a material fact on which the other person is really relying to make their decision. So let's give you like a real life example. If you are in a negotiation, let's say from an insurance claim for the benefits that you think your wife should get for an injury she had. And during the course of the negotiation, your wife tragically passes away. For you to continue as her spouse, to continue that negotiation without informing the insurance company that your wife has now passed would be fraud. Because the whole reason why they're in the negotiation is on the assumption that your wife is alive and therefore would get these benefits. Okay, the second domain outside of what's required by the law would be particularly in a professional context, or maybe if you're in a community organization, or maybe if you're serving in a church, would be to understand what are the organizational values, or organizational standards of practice or professional standards of practice. So many companies have some kind of ethical value set. Many churches have some mission statements, and just being aware of them and complying with them. Then the third thing you want to be thinking about are your own set of values and morals. And of course, that's always really tricky because they can change and they grow over time. But I guess what I might invite you to do, and this is what I do with my students, right? I ask them to think about if they're being honored at a dinner, right? What would you want other people to say about you? But then I also ask them to think about what do they want their obituary to say? What do they want their eulogy to say? What do they want their kids to know? When they look in the mirror, what can they actually look in the mirror and say, I feel good about that? And those kinds of questions I think are really important. So that's some guidance for you as you think about the ethics in a negotiation. I want to share a little bit of research though, and it's really research that I think might shed a little bit of light on why sometimes people who think of themselves as ethical do things that are actually not so ethical. And the research is about something that is called ethical fading. So what does that mean? Well, every year I ask my students after we do an ethics problem, I say to them, before you went into this negotiation, how many of you were planning to be unethical? And almost without exception, all of them keep their hands down. Almost nobody goes in and says, I'm voting for the devil today. My purpose is to be unethical. But if that's true, and again, to be fair, there are a small set of people who are prepared to do that. But for the vast majority of us, if that's true, what is happening? Well, what's happening here is that our brains are able cognitively to, in advance, think about how we would like to behave. But then this dynamic of ethical fading happens. That is, in the moment of decision, the ethical starkness of the question disappears. And instead, we have all sorts of other stories that come into our mind. For example, if I don't do this, somebody else will. Or even though this is terrible, I'm being better about it than someone else might. Or they treated me really badly. Or it's been exhausting. Or I at least deserve this. We come up with these excuses. This is what's called the ethical fading. And in that moment, when we see the pleasurable thing, like we can get a higher salary if we just fudge, or in fact, we don't have to give a price concession if we say the air conditioning in the house works, the ethical fading moment passes and we do the less than ethical thing. Now, here's the last piece that's really challenging is the research. And by the way, this is research that's been done by many people, but I'll mention two, Max Bazerman, who's at Harvard Business School, and Anne Tenbrizal, who's at Notre Dame. What their research shows is that we then go to the kind of Monday morning quarterbacking or the recollection piece. And in the recollection piece, human beings, because of self-serving biases, are very apt to retell the story in a way that excuses their behavior. So what does that mean for those of you who are watching who would like to prepare in that moment of ethics to actually see the ethical problem and make the right choice? So let's say a few things. First, in advance of a negotiation, spend some time in your preparation thinking about what are the kinds of questions that might come up that might have an ethical component to them. Second, in that moment when you are actually faced with the decision, take a pause. You know, in my new book, Conflict Resilience, a book that really talks about how to deal with conflict, we spend time really talking about the power of a pause when we're in a moment of conflict, but it also actually makes a difference in a moment of ethical decision making. Here's what the pause does. It actually allows your cognitive faculty of your brain to catch up with that emotional side that might want to give the easy, convenient, and less than ethical answer. And then lastly, on the reflection piece, identify people in your life who you think share your values, who you feel like they think well enough of you that you could sit down with them now and then and review a situation and get their honest feedback, and then be prepared to actually listen to that honest feedback. The other thing around this, right, is when you are doing a review, um, to really go into it with a fuller sense of who you are. That is to say, am an ethical, good person who maybe did something that was a little less than ethical here. If you have a more balanced view of yourself in that recollection piece, you're going to be able to actually call lessons. If your approach is simply, I can't consider this because if I consider this, then I'm a terrible person, then you're always going to find reasons why what you did was justified. So let's go back then to the decision by President Trump and the decision by these congresspeople to, in some sense, do something to meet with the Saudi crown prince in the White House and throw a party that some may think of as unethical. Here, there's a really interesting situation. Clearly, there's no legal issues. There is a question, however, about values. And from a negotiation perspective, the Saudis are incredibly important partners of the United States. Now, some listening to this might find that repugnant or distasteful. But the reality is that the United States does need to negotiate with the Saudis, and we do need to, therefore, be welcoming. So the ethical lapse here, to me, isn't the fact of the meeting, although there is this interesting question about whether, at least for most of us, there was a moral or ethical lapse in celebrating this person with the kind of dinner that he received, with the kind of comments that the president gave in the Oval Office, where he called him a great man. So that is to say, sometimes we may choose to negotiate because our BATNA is better negotiating, even with an unsavory character, perhaps, than not negotiating. But we can really distinguish that from whether we're putting that person on a pedestal. Similarly, if we look at what happened in the House of Representatives, to me, clearly here, there was ethical fading that occurred in that early decision before President Trump said it was okay to vote for the bill, when many Republicans said, we're not going to vote to release these files. It's hard to imagine that all of these representatives and all of these senators really believed that the Epstein files were a hoax and that they shouldn't be released in light of what happened to, literally dozens of victims, young girls and women who were sexually exploited. But what happens is in that decisional moment, people say things like, it doesn't make a difference. My vote won't matter. If I do this, I'll get elected out of my position, and I'm more useful to the people in my position than not in my position. And then suddenly, when the president says it's okay to vote for this, all of these people kind of breathe a sigh of relief and vote in a way that feels consistent with their moral viewpoint. So ethics are so important in negotiation. Each of us has a different compass on where we land with respect to them, but there are some important things to keep in mind. You do need to follow the law. It is helpful if you're negotiating in a professional context to know what the values of your organization are, and you should spend some time knowing what matters most to yourself. It's also really important to keep track of ethical fading so that in that moment of decision, you don't find yourself doing something you prefer not to do. But here is something I'm sure you would prefer to do, which is subscribe to this channel so you never miss new negotiation content, and keep watching the next video for more lessons and tactics on how to improve as a negotiator. Want to be a better negotiator? Watch this next video.